why should the rich and powerful say, please cut our throats? That's a way of saying, why don't we just commit suicide and get it all over with? It's worked. It may destroy us.
Thank you for being here today. I would like to ask you, should I refer to you as Professor Chomsky or Noam, or what would you prefer?
Noam's fine.
Cool. How are you, sir? How are you, Noam?
Perfectly okay.
Right. Okay, so I guess we should get right into it, and I'll just start asking you some questions. So firstly, I'd like to talk to you about linguistics. From what I understand, today you work mostly on advancing the theory of universal grammar, and it is often contested and misunderstood. What is the simplest way to explain it, and what do you think is most often misunderstood about it?
Simplest way is, let's start from the simplest. Take me and my dog. I can carry out this conversation. My dog can't. Is it a miracle? Or does it have to do with something about the innate organization of our neural and mental capacities? Well, obviously the latter. Then there's something coded in your brain, coded in my brain, not coded in my dog's brain, that allows you and me from infancy to acquire in a virtually reflexive manner this capacity, much the way we grow arms and legs. My dog, nothing. Chimpanzee, nothing. Well, if it's there should be a theory of it. The theory of it is called universal grammar. So if we're interested in understanding any of this, we're interested in universal grammar, the theory that tries to determine the character of these, the mechanisms involved in this, and the basis for them in genetic endowment. That's basically it. So we're either interested in the topics or not. If we're not interested in the topics, discussion over. We are interested in the topics, we're interested in universal grammar. There's a lot of misunderstanding of this, but it's not contentious.
And have you come across a critique of universal grammar that you think is valid, or?
How could there be? The only possible critique could be, we're the same as dogs. I don't regard that as a critique.
Right. But I feel like some people claim that statistical inference is a better explanation for language acquisition. What do you think of that claim?
Oh, that's a serious question. You could claim that statistical inference is universal grammar, except that it totally fails on everything. So, I mean, it's about the worst theory one can come up with. No positive results, refuted over and over again by the most elementary facts. So yes, a lot of people think it could. A lot of people think the earth is flat.
But I feel like this debate has come up again recently with LLMs and the emergence of artificial intelligence. Do you think that will change how we think about language acquisition?
Well, not if we're rational. The AI systems that are now being developed are designed so that in principle, they cannot tell us anything about language, learning, any other cognitive system. That's built in by design. There are very simple demonstrations of this. The most elementary one is that they work just as well for impossible languages that humans can't acquire as they do for the texts they're trained on in actual languages. It's as if a biologist were to come along and say, I got a great new theory of organisms. It lists a lot of organisms that exist a lot that can't possibly exist, and I can't tell you anything about the difference. We'd laugh.
And so if you think that debate might not be a productive area for research, what do you think will be the biggest question that will face the next generation of linguists?
There are valid debates, as in every area of science, about what is the nature of universal grammar, what is the biological endowment that distinguishes humans so radically from every other species. It's a common human endowment. As far as we know, there's no variation among human groups. There's nothing remotely analogous in the animal world. So therefore, but as to what the system actually is, yes, not only there are plenty of debates, but I debate myself. Every paper that comes out rejects what I said a year ago. That's the way science works.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ask you about some of your thoughts about the media, if that's okay. So, I'd like to turn to some of those issues. And one of the problems, the problems of the media seem to hold more weight now than ever, with the 2020 Doomsday Clock statement citing the continued corruption of the information ecosphere as heightening the nuclear and climate threats to human existence. In Manufacturing Consent, you outline the problems with our media institutions, but what do you think are the solutions? What specific changes should we push for to change the media? And are there any existing models for how media should work that we might draw upon?
Well, when you look at the setting of the Doomsday Clock, they did the latest one, 90 seconds to midnight, did list three things. The rising danger of nuclear war, failure to deal with the existential crisis of climate destruction, and the deterioration of the sphere for rational discussion. It's not just the media. They were talking about the disintegration of an arena in which rational discussion can take place. I don't think you can trace that to the media. It's much broader. So, I mean, take a look at people's opinions. It's mind-boggling. So, for example, take Republicans in the United States. About 2/3 think that the Democratic Party is bringing in illegal migrants in order to destroy the white race, the Great Replacement, it's called. About half think the Democratic Party is run by sexual predators who are grooming children for sexual abuse. There's a huge anti-vaccine movement based on all kinds of ideas, and I can't even talk about them. They're so crazy. It's killing lots of people. A lot of this goes back a century. Has nothing to do with media. About a century ago, the corporations that are producing lethal substances recognize they have to do something to make profit. Started with lead, then tobacco, and then asbestos, most recently fossil fuels. They understood very well that it will not do to try to refute the claim, the demonstration of their harmful effects. If you try to refute it, you'll be immediately shown to be, your claims will be immediately shown to be false. So what they decided to do was quite reasonable. Let's just sow doubt. Say, we're not sure. Why don't we wait till, let's take fossil fuels, the most recent one. The fossil fuel industries have known since the early 70s that they're on a course of destroying the human species. ExxonMobil scientists were in the lead in studying the effects of climate change and destruction of the environment. They sent their reports to the corporate headquarters where they were put in a drawer somewhere. By 1988, James Hansen, well-known geophysicist, testified in the Senate about this, a lot of publicity. They realized they can't just keep quiet about it anymore. So they pulled the same strategy that had been used by the lead, the tobacco, other lethal industries. Let's not deny the claims because we know they're true. Let's sow doubt. We don't really know. Haven't looked at sunspots, haven't looked at cloud cover. It's just a bunch of liberal, pointy-headed scientists. Why should we believe them? So let's just sow doubt about science and rationality. It's worked. It may destroy us. It's worked very well. You go back to 1980, you had an election in the United States. One candidate, Jimmy Carter, said, there's a climate crisis coming. You should lower the thermostat in your house, put on have to do something to deal with it. The other candidate, Ronald Reagan, said, it's morning in America. Get your SUV, drive down the road, enjoy yourself. Just a bunch of liberal crazies, what do you care? Okay, that may have been an epitaph for human existence. And it's gone on year after year. Now that's one aspect of it. There are other aspects, like the effect, the appeal of demagogues to the undercurrents. Almost every society has poisonous undercurrents, racism, sexism, one thing or another. So you can appeal to that to try to mobilize people for commonly the goal of increasing profit for the powerful corporate sector. That's caused a tremendous, and the other thing is the effect of the neoliberal assault on the society. You remember Margaret Thatcher, 1980, saying, there's no society. If a homeless person on the street doesn't have a place to live, it's his fault. So he can't come and build a society. Of course, she knew she was lying through her teeth. For the rich and powerful, there's a very complex, supportive society. Chambers of commerce, trade associations, the powerful state, which they largely control. But for the rest of us, no society. You're out there alone. Try to survive on the market if you can somehow. That's been the neoliberal assault. It's had many effects. In England, austerity programs. In the United States, where it's studied most carefully, about $50 trillion have been stolen from the lower 90% of the population, handed over to the top 1% in the past 40 years of legislation and programs. Well, that leaves people angry, resentful, nobody speaking up for them. Somebody does try to speak up for them, like Jeremy Corbyn, and successfully, 2017, he raised the labor vote more than in a generation. When that happens, the establishment comes down on them like a ton of bricks, the way they did with Corbyn. Got to destroy him. We can't allow any break in this system. I don't have to go through the lies and deceit. It was very effective. Well, that's left people in a situation where they're lost. We're alone, can't deal with it. We're easy prey to anti-science cults, to demagogues, and it's left a very dangerous situation.
Certainly, but I would like to suggest that perhaps that is to do with the media insofar as the method by which Jeremy Corbyn was attacked by the establishment was through the mainstream media, and that the way that the corporations are able to spread their misinformation is through, you know, the filters of the propaganda model, such as the size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms, and the advertising as the primary income source, as from manufacturing consent. And when we look at the beliefs that people have today that are based on that disinformation, it's often because of a loss of trust in the media. And so I guess part of what I would like to know is that, you know, without going through a revolution, without within the confines of capitalist society, what can we do to actually change how the media works? What can we do to restore trust and deliver proper information to the people?
First of all, it's wrong to distrust the media. Take a look at our book, Manufacturing Consent, which very few people have gone beyond maybe the title in the first chapter. But about a third of the book is defense of the media, defense of the courage and integrity of reporters on the ground, do a good job. And it's a defense of them against the attack by, in this particular case, by Freedom House, which launched a major attack against the media, claiming they were anti-patriotic, they were anti-American, they lost the war in Vietnam, full of lies, total, like the Corbin case. We went through it, refuted all the lies, doesn't make any difference, nobody even looked at them. But it's true that the media are the instrument through which these attacks take place, and many other things. So, for example, take the Iraq War. It's now 20 years. Try to find a statement. I haven't checked the British media. You can do that. See if you can find a statement that says the war was anything worse than a mistake. It was the main establishment journal in the United States, Foreign Affairs. It calls it the liberation of Iraq, which failed because of bad tactics. Barack Obama is praised to the skies because he called it a strategic blunder, echoing Russian generals in Afghanistan who said it was a strategic blunder. We don't honor them for that. See if you can find, in the United States, I don't think you can literally find one statement by anyone anywhere near the establishment who said it was a major war crime, destroyed a country, people responsible for it should be subjected to the International Criminal Court. Try to find one. You won't. I mean, at the fringe, you know, I can say it. We live in free societies, so I'm not sent to jail. So you can say it, but nowhere near the mainstream. And case after case like that. Well, is it the fault of the media, or is it the general intellectual culture that's reflected through the media? Actually, George Orwell had a couple of sentences about this, which are worth reading. I'm sure you've read Animal Farm. Have you read the introduction to Animal Farm? Probably not. Did you actually? Because it's rare. I mean, it was suppressed. It was found 30 years later in his unpublished paper. Not one of his great articles, but interesting. It's basically telling the people of free England that you shouldn't feel so self-righteous about totalitarian states, because in England, with unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And one of the methods he mentions is just immersion in the general culture, having a good education, going to Cambridge and Oxford. You get instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things that just wouldn't do to say, just gets built in. Well, I think he was on target. There's a lot of truth to that. So yes, we can talk about the media, and we should, and how they're constructed and what their framework is and the kind of filtering that goes through and so on. But it's a much deeper problem.
And so then how would we go? Is there any how would we go about fixing that then? How do we go about just slowly pushing the culture towards more anti-establishment thought?
Pushing the culture towards honest recognition of what the world is like, and it succeeds. Take a look at, you're not old enough to, but you can read about it. Take a look at what the world was like, the United States and England in the 1960s, before the activism of the 60s, which greatly civilized the society. Take a look at what it was like. Talk about the United States. Britain was about the same. The United States, there were anti-miscegenation laws, which were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. There was no issue of women's rights. Wasn't it? Women have to know their place. Even the activist left movements, women were supposed to serve the young men, to do the clerical work in the background while we bright young men ran and everything. In fact, a lot of the origin of the women's movement comes from that, from resentment about that. There was federal housing, federal supported housing, segregated by law, no blacks, all sorts of things which are considered intolerable now were perfectly normal. How did it change? Well, you know how it changed, by young people mostly engaging themselves in a major struggle, which was not easy, which did finally manage to break through and to some extent civilize the societies. Well, that's how it's done. That's how slavery ended. That's how women's rights were established. That's how torture was ended, theoretically at least, in prisons. Almost anything you can think about. There are no other ways.
Well, I guess it's interesting because I feel like nowadays it's become a truism to talk about how so many people are disenchanted from political engagement, and particularly young people. And I'm interested in what your opinion might be about what tactics one could use or what strategies there are to try and get people engaged. Do you think it's just, starting on a micro level and pushing your friends towards politics, or do you think there are any grander strategies by which we could, get more people involved with politics?
Well, if there are grander strategies, nobody's told us about them for the last couple thousand years. The only strategies that anybody knows are just get out there and get to work. Take something concrete. Opposition to the Vietnam War. Vietnam War was the worst crime since the Second World War. Notice that's not recognized. No talk about it in the intellectual culture. It was just a mistake. The U.S. Couldn't protect South Vietnam from North Vietnamese aggression or some story like that. The actual truth of it, it's all there, but it's not part of the culture. But how did the anti-war movement get started? Well, I can tell you because I was very much involved. Talking to a couple of people in their living room, talking to a small group of people in a church, if you could find one. You couldn't have public demonstrations because they'd be broken up violently with the applause of the media by students, literally. Took years before you could even have a public meeting to oppose it, 6 or 7 years. John F. Kennedy sharply escalated the war. Nobody cared. To this day, almost nobody knows about it. There's a kind of Kennedy cult which denies it, but that's what it took. Hard work on the ground. Finally, it took a lot of young people just refusing to fight. That's a serious decision when you're 18 years old. You're going into exile, prison, obloquy, not easy, but a lot of people did it. Well, that things even happened on the ground. To its credit, the US Army fell apart. Soldiers in Vietnam, young people, said, we're not going to do this anymore. The United States did make a tactical error, tried to use a civilian army to fight a colonial war. Can't do that. The British knew much better. You use Gurkhas and sepoys, not kids you take off the street to go murder women and children. That doesn't work very well. French used the Foreign Legion. The United States and Britain now use what are called contractors, mercenaries, South African killers, and so on. That makes much more sense than sending a civilian army. So the civilian army began to fall apart. You just can't put people you take off the streets and say, go murder women and children, burn down huts, and so on. That's tough to do. So now they're smarter, it's drones, contractors, and so on. But all of this happened because of popular organization, not any other way.
Okay. Well, I would like to maybe talk about some of your opinions about the development of anarchism. But I would just like to first establish, do you still identify as a anarcho-syndicalist or libertarian socialist?
Ever since I was about 12 years old, I don't see any reason to change it. I think those are basically the right ideas. At this particular moment in history, there are crises so overwhelming that these issues are somewhat in the background. We don't solve these immediate crises, everything's going to be moot.
Okay, well, I guess in some ways, a lot of anarchists or libertarian socialists might argue that part of the crises are the consequence of the lack of a realization of their movement. Like that it's a process of capitalism that will not be removed without capitalism, and because corporations are so effective at capturing state power, that it is difficult to see a way forward through the state. And what would you think of that attitude amongst anarchists and socialists?
That's a way of saying, why don't we just commit suicide and get it all over with? This is part of the irrationality we were talking about before. I mean, I think that analysis is basically correct. Capitalism is a death sentence. That's why business has never permitted capitalism. The business community for hundreds of years has been in the lead in trying to regulate capitalism so it doesn't destroy itself, because it will if left alone. So you have to have regulations, controls. In the modern economy, you have to have massive bailouts, radical interference in the market to try to ensure that the system sustains. You need a very powerful state which intervenes radically to prevent market forces from destroying everyone. They understand that. But the fact is that the time scale for eliminating, overcoming this system of domination and control is not incommensurate with the time scale required to deal with the urgent problems that we face. There's a very interesting doctrine, which isn't talked about much, called the Stimson doctrine. Henry Stimson was the Secretary of War during the early 40s, in charge of the mobilization for war. There was real mobilization. People tightened their belts, didn't drive, so on and so forth, except for one sector of the population, the business world. They profited enormously. And Stimson explained that. He said, in a capitalist society, if you want to get anything done, you have to make sure business is happy. So you guys tighten your belts, but there has to be plenty of profiteering. Well, exactly the same now. You want to deal with climate change? You can't just go ahead and do it. You have to bribe the rich and the powerful, so maybe they'll help. The stupidest, craziest possible way to do it. But as long as you're within this framework of institutions, you really don't have much choice. You have to get this done fast. Try to change the institutional structures as much as you can, but recognize that large-scale change is just not on the nearby agenda, not within the appropriate time scale. You got to face reality. Can't pretend you're living in a dream world.
So do you think, because perhaps the stronger force than a libertarian socialist or anarchist force in modern day society that one might tap into is a more authoritarian socialist streak represented by people like Corbyn or Bernie Sanders? Do you think those are realistic possibilities through which we can solve the issues, or do you think the only way forward is simply through the Stimson doctrine of bribing business?
I think that movements like Corbyn and Sanders are very important ways to mitigate the worst crimes, set the stage for something better, deal with the imminent crises. And they're under sharp attack. Corbyn is a very striking case. He did try, he's a very decent person, tried to create a Labor Party that would be participatory, that would answer to the needs of its constituents, working people, poor, suffering, people abroad in trouble. As soon as he got started, especially after his great success in 2017, sharply raising the labor vote, the whole establishment tried to destroy him. In the case of Bernie Sanders, it wasn't that extreme, but sort of similar. The Democratic National Committee, Clinton run basically, corporate oriented, the media, pretty much the same. They tried to destroy him. They didn't succeed. He's still there. And the movement had some effect. But of course, that's going to happen. Why should the rich and powerful say, please cut our throats? They're not going to. They fight a constant, bitter class war. And if they're allowed to do it by themselves, they win. So you have to try. In fact, Thatcher and Reagan understood this very well, or whoever did their thinking for them. The first act of both of them was to attack the labor movement, try to undermine and destroy the labor movement. That's the main line of defense that people have in class war. So get rid of it. They attacked the educational system too. In the United States, public education has been under sharp attack for 40 years. Makes sense. You want a passive, ignorant population, not people who can think or talk to each other, get together. So let's get rid of critical thinking in the schools. Teach to test, worst kind of way. Defund the schools. Try to get rid of them. All of this makes perfect sense for class war, but you have to understand it and try to counter it. And people like Corbyn and Sanders could have made a positive move forward. Sanders, to some extent, did. If you take a look at Biden's programs, they're not great by any means, but there are good elements to them. They come out of Bernie Sanders' office and the Senate Budget Committee, and that comes from activism on the ground, like the Sunrise Movement, who sat in congressional offices, got some support from young congressional representatives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who came in on the Sanders wave. So they were able to have some effect. led to the Sanders program, which were cut back, of course, sharply, but something remained. That's what you, in the real world, that's what you have to do. If there was more public support, could go beyond. And you can think of many concrete things. Take the example of the 2008 housing financial crisis. It's a major crisis. One of the things that happened during that crisis was that the Obama administration basically nationalized the auto industry. It's a huge industry. The government sort of bought it out. Well, there were a couple of options at that point. One option was to return it, to bail out the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks, and made predatory loans and so on, hand the auto industry back to its former owners, maybe a couple of different faces, have them go ahead producing exactly what we don't need, oversized cars and trucks to cause massive traffic jams and pollute the atmosphere. That was one possibility, the one that was taken. There was another possibility. The other possibility would be, okay, we basically nationalize the auto industry. Let's turn it over to the workforce and communities, have them produce what we need, like cheap mass transportation. That was not contemplated. Why? Because of the failure of the left. There was no popular movement advocating for that. Would have been accepted by a large part of the workforce. Wasn't there. Well, that goes back to the answer to your question. If it's there, things can get done. If it's not there, they won't.
If we accept the idea of working with capitalism or bribing the rich as a way towards progress on crucial matters, and what do you think of the concept of universal basic income as a way forward to achieve a sense of equality? Because as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I understand, in places like Alaska, these deeply Republican states, when there were surpluses in, oil money, the people essentially decided to sort of take that money as a check, as a form of basic income, instead of giving it to the government out of libertarian sentiment. And with the development of things like AI, I believe OpenAI, the company that developed ChatGPT, are some of the biggest researchers into universal basic income.
Well, first of all, I don't really accept the assumptions. I don't think we have to accept these things. We should be trying to change them as many ways as we can. Could be radical. So what I had just mentioned about the auto industry, if there had been a popular activist left movement pressing for that, that would be a radical change. That would put a large part of American industry under the control of the workforce and communities. That's radical social change. And it was possible, but the movement wasn't there. Same thing all the way through. Well, let's take Alaska. The choice wasn't either to the population or the government. The money did go to the government, and the government distributed it to the population, not out of any libertarian need, just like Alberta, Canada. We're devastating the environment, but making a lot of money out of it, so let's enjoy ourselves. Nothing libertarian about that. What about UBI? Well, it depends on the context. So the far right, Milton Friedman, the guru of neoliberalism, strongly in favor of UBI. Why? Because it could have destroyed the welfare system, which he hated. UBI in those terms is a savage system. UBI means I'm a university professor, fairly decent income, so I get money from UBI. Some poor Black woman who has a single woman with 3 kids, no transportation, no food, she gets some money from UBI. but not food stamps. No, I got to cut that out. Not some limited degree of medical care. Got to cut that out. That's UBI from Friedman's point of view. Yes, a terrific way to get rid of the whole welfare system, which, with all of its flaws, does benefit people in need. And if you're a pure savage, you want to get rid of that. Okay, that's one kind of UBI. There's another kind of UBI which says, let's keep and in fact expand radically the systems for support of those in need, but let's give a floor. Everybody will have a certain floor. You won't get below this. That's another kind of UBI. That kind would make some sense, but you have to ask in what context it's being presented.
Well, another thing I would like to address then is you talk about the need for a popular movement, and particularly as far as I imagine it, that would take the form of protests. And part of what we see in Europe is a sort of authoritarian sweep of legislation that is very much trying to cut down on the amount of activism. What do you think are the tactics that we can use to either go about larger change or to even combat these direct curtailing of the right to protest?
First of all, that's normal. You expect state power to be used by the forces that control the state to protect themselves. You take a look at the history of labor, especially in countries like the United States, which has a more extreme form of business rule than most others do for historical reasons. Very violent labor history. Into the late 1930s, my childhood, workers were getting murdered on strikes by security forces and so on. I sometimes watched these as a child, picket lines being attacked and so on. That's natural. Any form of protest against power and authority is going to be resisted by those with power. How do you deal with it? There's no general answer. Depends on the specific circumstances. I took part in any number of demonstrations, jailed over and over. My association with Washington, D.C. was tear gas and mace. That's what you're faced with. As soon as I got to the city, that's what I expected. Okay, you find ways of living with it. There's much harsher forms. And sometimes you have to deal with them. Kettling demonstrators is a technique for preventing demonstrations from moving on. So try to find ways around them. But there's no, it takes clever tactics on the part of the demonstrators, but you have to deal with the circumstances that exist. There's no formulas. Just understand what's happening. There is a constant class war. And take a look at what's called neoliberalism. You take a course in it in the university, they'll tell you it's about markets and small government. Total baloney. Radical interference with markets for the benefit of the rich, expansion of government for the benefit of the rich. Neoliberalism is just class war, one form of class war. I gave you some numbers, $50 trillion, a pretty nice estimate for 40 years. So face the reality, put aside the illusions, get to work to try to deal with them in whatever concrete way you can. If it's talking to people, to neighbors in their living room, well, you do that. If it's organizing mass demonstrations, do that. If it's taking over the auto industry and handing it over to the workforce, do that. There's no, you have to be practical and pragmatic. What can we do? What can be achieved under existing circumstances? Let's push the boundaries.
Okay. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I'd just like to ask you one final question. and that is, if people only remember one thing from all your work and activism, what would you like that to be?
Just that you should try your best in a difficult world.
Okay.
There's no general principles.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope that was okay. How did I do?
Okay, very good.
Yeah.